Okay, so I don't know about you, but when I was little, I heard the stories about Paul Bunyan, and they were like, he was this big lumberjack with his best friend was a ox for some reason who was blue, and I don't know if they ever explained why he was blue, but his name was Babe, and he was an ox, and his best friend. And Paul Bunyan just liked to cut down lots of trees, and I think they made the story to like, I don't know, make us think that logging was okay because it's a big giant that's doing it, and he's happy and jolly. And while we're at it, we'll say that he made the Grand Canyon with his axe, because that makes all kinds of sense. Anyway, so that's what I came into this movie thinking. Oh, Paul Bunyan, he's gonna be a nice guy and he's gonna save the day. But that's not the case at all. The movie opens with these guys. They're loggers. So these loggers, they're like, we're cutting down all these trees, and I can cut down more than you because my plaid shirt is thicker than yours and my beard's longer. And that makes sense. And because I think that directly associates with how good you are at cutting trees. And so they're cutting trees and they're having a good time. And the lead logger, he's like, oh, I need to go get something from inside my jacket because it's cold. And he goes and he leaves. And when he comes back to everybody with their heads chopped off. And he's like, what in tarnation? And then there's Paul Bunyan. And anyway, Paul Bunyan's not very handsome or anything. So he shows up with his axe and he chopped all those people, and then the main guy's like, oh my gosh, why are you killing us? And Paul Bunyan, he doesn't talk, he just grabs him, and there's this big saw that's going for no reason. He's like, I'm going to throw you into the saw instead of just hitting you with my axe. And so he pushes the guy in the saw, and it's really bloody, it's funny. And so then we cut to present times. And there's all these first-time offenders that are like, I don't know, like late teens, early 20s. And they're like, you guys have done this crime, and it's your first offense, so we're not going to send you to jail. We're going to send you to this rehab cabin up in the forest with your psychologist, but also this drill sergeant. And they're going to whip you guys into shape because you guys are bad and you did bad things. And so they march all these kids into a bus, and they're like, what'd you do? And this is the token black kid's like, I was a hacker, and he stole all these identities and got a bunch of money, and so that's him. He's a hacker. And then there's some girl, and she's like, I punched a cop because he grabbed my ass because I'm the hot girl in the movie. And they're like, that makes sense. And then there's like the bad boy, and he's like, well, I'm just bad all around, and they're making me go to this cabin. And then there's a couple other girls who really don't matter too much. I can't remember what they did. They weren't important. And they never got topless, so I didn't remember them. And so they load all these kids on the bus, and they're like, we're going to this cabin, and you're gonna be rehabilitated. So they take the bus to the cabin, and all kinds of antics ensue, and people try to have sex, and the psychologist is like, no, that's the first rule of this cabin is no sex with other people because you guys were bad, and you can't do those things and make babies because we don't want bad babies. And they do their usual drill sergeant stuff, and they go for hikes and all this stuff. So anyway, one day they're hiking. They're hiking in the mountains, and the token black guy and the bad boy, they break off, and they're walking around exploring, and they find all these bones, and they're like, whoa, look at these bones. They're really big, and I don't know what kind of animal this was. And then they find the head of this skeleton. And, oh, it's this big ox-looking thing. And it has these giant horns. And they're like, oh, cool, I'm going to take this giant horn as a souvenir. Well, what they didn't know is what they had found was Babe the Blue Ox apparently somehow got exhumed from his grave. They never explained that, why he was above ground. But it was his corpse and his horn, and they took it. Paul Bunyan, who's still roaming the forest, he likes to check up on his long-dead buddy every once in a while, and he's like, hey, your horn's not here. The rest of your skeleton's here, but your horn's not. So now it's time to go on a murderous rampage. That's how everything starts. So they take the horn, and they think it's cool. They have this big horn of his ox, and they're hiking around, and out of nowhere, here comes Paul Bunyan with his big axe. And he cuts the really slutty girl in half. And That's not good. Everybody's scared, and they're like, oh, all of a sudden there's this giant in the middle of the forest. We don't know what's going on. So they run. More people get cut, and they make it back to their cabin. And they're like, we don't know what's going on. There's a big giant chasing us. We don't know what the deal is. So then, fortunately for them, this old mountain man shows up. And he's like, oh, what are you guys doing? Hiding in this cabin. And they're like, oh, there's a big giant with an axe chasing us. And he's like, oh, that's just Paul Bunyan. But let me tell you the real story about him, and so you know why he's chasing after you and trying to kill you. And they're like, yeah, that'd be great, because we're in this cabin. He's out there somewhere looking for us. So he does his little reference back. He does a little flashback. And he's like, well, what happened is Paul Bunyan's parents, they had a baby, named him Paul, and he ended up being really large, and he didn't stop growing, and he was a big giant. And he didn't have any friends until he met this big blue ox that, he's an ox. He doesn't have any thoughts. And so he's like, I'll be your friend, Paul, because I don't care what you look like. We can be best friends. And so they're best friends. And so then wintertime comes, and it's a really bad winter. And all the loggers, they're like, oh, it's so cold, and so we're super hungry. And one day they're roaming through the forest, and they see a giant blue cow, and they're like, well, that's probably delicious. We should probably eat it. And so they're like, let's shoot it. And they shoot it in the face and kill Paul Bunyan's ox. And they take it home to eat it. So Paul Bunyan, he's roaming through the forest, and he sees the loggers, and he's like, oh, they're having a good time and a big feast. And he's like, oh, shit. That's a really large cow they have there over the fire. It's also blue. Oh, it's my best friend. They're eating my best friend. And so that's why he murdered all the people at the very beginning of the movie. So anyway, that's why he's after so the kids were like, oh, he's after us because we took the horn of his best friend who was buried up here. So if we just give it back, everything's going to be fine. The guy who's like the bad boy, he's like, well, that's easy. I'll just go outside. Where the giant's waiting for some reason instead of smashing the cabin. And I'll give him the horn back. So he walks outside and he yells profanities. He's like, here you go, you ugly son of a bitch. And he throws the horn into the forest. He's like, there you go. And then it's silent. Well, then the horn comes flying back and stabs him through the chest. Because Paul Bunyan, he didn't just want the horn, he wanted revenge. And so that guy's dead. And then the old mountain man's like, oh, something else must be going on. So he looks around the room and he sees this other girl who the whole movie is like pretty insignificant. He's like, hey, you look a lot like this girl that he used to be in love with before he murdered all those loggers who lived in the old town. So he saw you and he's like, oh, I'm going to try to take her back to my cave and make Paul Bunyan babies, which I don't know how physically it would work because he's really big. And she's really tiny. I feel like it might kill her, but Paul Bunyan, he's not very smart. He just likes to murder things, so he's probably like, I don't know what he did out in the forest with his giant penis. He probably put it in pine trees and used the sap for some kind of strange lubricant, which I feel like you get a lot of splinters, but not important. So basically this whole time they're in the cabin explaining this story and so on. He could have just smashed the cabin. I don't understand what was going on. And so anyway, they're like, well, you look like this girl that you used to be in love with, so we're going to keep you around because you won't kill everybody if you're with us. And she's like, oh, but my dad's the sheriff, which they never explained before, but all of a sudden her dad's the sheriff, and he's going to come save us. So they wait in the cabin. Well, token black guy, he's still alive, surprisingly, and he's just mad. He's like, I'm not going to take this from Paul Bunyan, and I'm going to be super tough because everybody thought I was a nerd this whole time. So he runs outside and just yells at Paul Bunyan. I don't think he has a weapon. He's just like, I'm over here, and Paul Bunyan's like, I'm going to kill you. But instead, he kind of stops paying attention to the black guy. I think he was confused. He probably never saw a Negro person in his life. I'm going to kill this girl instead who came out to try to tell the black guy to come back inside. So he just grabs this girl and he throws her against a tree, and she kind of breaks into pieces. It's pretty awesome. And the black guy's really mad, and he's like, I hate you, Paul Bunyan, and he grabs a stick, and I don't know what he's going to do with the stick, but he starts to charge Paul Bunyan, and oh, but the sheriff shows up. Sheriff saves the day, and sheriff rolls up, and he's like, You leave my daughter alone! And he shoots him with his rifle in the head. And Paul Bunyan, he falls down and smashes the cabin because he got shot in the head. And everybody's like, oh, you did it! So everybody's celebrating. But then the mountain man, all of a sudden, for, again, another unexplained reason, is like, he was actually my friend, and I never told you that, and we hung out all the time, and we played chess on my balcony, and I would make a move, and he'd come make a move, and, you know, games took months, but he was my only friend, so I'm mad that you shot him in the head, so I'm not letting you leave. And he points a shotgun at him. And the black guy's like, I'm not done being brave. So he steps in front and is like, let us go, and grabs the shotgun, like the barrel of the shotgun, but he doesn't move out of the way. He just grabs the barrel like the guy's going to stop. So the guy just shoots him in the stomach, and he falls down, but his first line after he takes a straight shotgun blast to the stomach, or he's like, is it bad? And I'm like, dude, you just took a shotgun blast to the stomach. Why did you ask if it's bad? And after asking if it's bad, it's literally, I had to rewind because I was like, this is amazing. It was 6 seconds later he died after asking if it was bad. So he had to know he was dying. And in the background, Paul Bunyan gets up. He's mad because he got shot in the head. And he throws the axe from a distance. And so the axe spinning through the air. We see an axe flying towards you, and they all duck. And instead of just ducking or thinking something's going on, the mountain man just stands there and the axe chops him in half. Yet he somehow still looks back at Paul Bunyan with his half a body and is like, why'd you do that? I thought we were friends. And he's crying. And I was like, that's not going to happen. You'd be dead. Mountain man's out of the way. Sheriff is like, my truck's over here. Let's go. So they run to the truck. And his daughter, which up to this point, for whatever reason, you don't know this, but he throws her the keys and he's like, remember how I told you I was going to teach you to drive? Well, now is the time. So then they start driving away really fast. And Paul Bunyan's chasing them. So if you go ahead, picture, you know the scene in Jurassic Park where they're driving away from the T-Rex and he's chasing them in the Jeep? Basically, replace the T-Rex with a giant man with an axe. And that's what's happening. And so the sheriff's riding in the bed of the pickup, shooting bullets back at Paul Bunyan, where the first time he one-shotted him and it dropped him. This time, you know, he doesn't care about bullets. The truck runs out of gas, and they're like, oh no, we gotta run the distance. And so they run across the bridge, and Paul Bunyan, he's right behind him. And they're like, oh, we can only get halfway across the bridge. And here comes Paul Bunyan, he's coming across the bridge. But then, that posse that they riled up, you know, they show up on the far side of the bridge, behind Paul Bunyan. And there's like 20 dudes with assault rifles. And so they line up in a battle line, and they're just like, fire! And so they just all unload their clips into Paul Bunyan. He's taking all these shots, and even though one bullet took him down before, he gets hit like 87 times at least. And he's just like, bah! And he gets shot a whole bunch. And they play this kind of like sad music because you're like, oh, maybe we should feel sorry for Paul Bunyan. And so anyway, after they all empty their clips, they're like, okay, well, we're done shooting. And Paul Bunyan kind of does a little stumble to the side. And he's like, blah! And then he falls over the edge of the bridge into the water. And he sinks, and he's dead. And so then my favorite dialogue of the movie comes up, and one of the posse members is like, "Holy shit, was that the Loch Ness monster?" And the guy next to him's like, "No, you idiot, that was Sasquatch." And then this guy right behind him's like, "You guys are both idiots. That wasn't the Mothman or a dragon. That was Paul fucking Bunyan." And I just lost it. They didn't seem surprised that they were shooting at a big giant with an axe. So then it zooms in on the three survivors, and the psychologist looks at the little girl, and she's like, "Well, I think you made it through the course." And the little girl's like, I'll never break the law again. And thanks for teaching me to drive, Daddy." And then movie's over. It was one of the best movies ever. But oh man, I still have to tell you, I still have to tell you about Bikini Girls on Ice. So that'll be the next one. Because that one just went beyond amazing. Okay, so I still have to tell you about Breadcrumbs, The Maze, Cheerleader Massacre, and Bikini Girls on Ice.